This is Deke Copenhaver, author of The Changemaker, The Art of Building Better Leaders, former mayor of Augusta, Georgia, consultant and speaker. And today on Dov's show, we're going to talk about why leading to the extremes or the vocal minority is not leading at all. It's cowardice. And I even have a special bit of information of a secret on James Brown that you may not know.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. Let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? Do you have the agility to deal with change when it comes at you? Or rather than reacting to change, are you a change maker? Well, stay tuned because that's exactly where we're going on today's show. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I am the Dragonist, and I'm here to assist you in tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything. It transforms everything, and that is turning meaning into action. To find out more about me, you can simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our other podcast, which is Curiosity Bites. Curiosity Bites is the answer to the question, how can we bring people together who completely disagree? This is exactly what your heart and your soul and your mind has been craving. It's your chance to sit in on some real and oftentimes intense conversations with some of the world's most interesting people. I'm talking about astronauts, neuroscientists, philosophers, holy people, quantum physicists, skeptics, entrepreneurs, multi-Grammy award-winning artists, some folks that you might think you would completely disagree with, who you will find incredibly fascinating. Simply go to dovbaron.com and find out how you can sink your teeth into Curiosity Bites. And as always, you can find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever it is that you tune into podcasts. We really appreciate it. And we need your help in staying relevant. So please get over to there, wherever it is that you tune into your podcast. And please do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. If you can write a review, subscribe to the show, and share it with your friends, that would be awesome. We really appreciate it. If you're a regular listener, we want to send a big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. You can also listen to us on Google Home and Alexa. Simply say, play Dov Baron podcast. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. I think you might have noticed that politics today, well, it's leaked into everyone's life. Most of us might feel impotent at dealing with the situation. However, as a leader of people, you will find yourself walking a very fine line between what people do and what they believe. And so the question becomes, what is your responsibility to your community? Again, will you be reactive or proactive? Because when it comes to building better leaders, you are either passive or you are a change maker. Well, stay tuned because that's exactly where we're going today. My guest on this episode is Deke Copenhaver. He is a proven leader who has successfully challenged the status quo of politics as usual and mainstream media and even the publishing world. He's a rare leader in today's world he's driven by altruism, empathy, and a focus on serving others and bringing individuals from all walks of life together in common ground. And he's political? What? Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome retired after 9 years, mayor of Augusta, Georgia, best-selling author of The Changemaker, The Art of Building Better Leaders, Mr. Deke Copenhaver!
Job, thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for having me.
Hey, mate, I've been looking forward to this. You and I always have a great chat. Every conversation we've had has always been really awesome, and I'm glad to bring that to our audience. So, in the context of what I was just saying, one of my questions I like to ask leaders these days is objectively diagnosing it. What do you honestly see as the state of leadership today?
I see that there are good leaders out there. I'll tell you, it's interesting, Dob. I view society as sort of a bell curve.
Mm,
And I think that most people are in the center of the bell curve, center right or center left. But all we see in politics and in the mainstream media are the extremes.
hmm
So I think the great leadership efforts out there, and I see them at the local level. I see it in people who work for not for profits. I see it in families, but don't necessarily get the highlight that they should, which is very unfortunate.
That is such a good point because, as well as I do that the media, particularly the news, that their byline is, if it bleeds, it leads. If it screams, we're going to pay attention to it. And as an example that I often bring up to people is that Donald Trump was given $3 billion worth of free advertising in 2016
Hmm.
by the people who are very anti-Trump today. So, it's a great example of if you scream loud enough and you pay, you're making a big fuss, then you get the attention. And meanwhile, there are local leaders and leaders, as you said, of nonprofits who are quietly going about their business, making a tremendous difference, and we don't even know about them. And I think that that's a very sad state of affairs, don't you?
I do, and to me, Dov, pandering to the extremes is not leadership at all.
No.
Leadership is about uniting people around a common cause. It's about making people feel safe, secure, included, and that their voices are heard. So that to me is leadership. And that's politically, are we seeing that type of leadership? No, unfortunately not. And that's not just in the US, that's in a lot of other countries
Oh,
as
it's
well.
all over the
But
world. Yeah.
but I don't think that people want to be made to feel afraid and divided. I think people want to be brought together. And I think honestly, COVID is a commonality amongst us all. We're all dealing with the humanity of the situation. So, as a world and through leaders like yourself, we have a wonderful opportunity to truly come together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When in this sort of time of where everybody's claiming to be an influencer,
Hmm.
um, one of the questions I like to ask the leaders I'm honored to speak with on here is who is somebody who's had influence and impact on you and on your leadership who we might not even know of? It's exactly what we're just talking about, who may not be the screaming attention person, but it might have been somebody, who was completely irrelevant in the global platform or even in the general platform, but that really impacted and influenced you as a leader. Who would that be?
That would be my father, Bill Copenhaver. I was born one of five children. I was the youngest of five children. My father flew B-17 bombers in World War II,
Mm,
but he was raised by a single mother during the Great Depression, one of five children. My grandmother was a school teacher who stressed education, but he went on to, after he graduated from Virginia Tech, climbed the ladder in the corporate world and became a CEO. But he
wow.
was a very ethical CEO who really was strongly tied to his employees. But it's basically that's the theme of my book, The Changemaker. I was doing a speaking engagement last summer, and somebody said, "Well, what's at the core of your book?" I said that it's that you can maintain your character and integrity and treat people with dignity and respect, even in leadership positions in politics, and still be successful. But I saw that reflected in my father in the corporate world, and that's the values that I took into being a public servant. But after I told this gentleman that, he said, "I can't wait to read your book because I don't think that's possible." but
Wow.
I've got a case study of doing it for 9 years as mayor of Augusta.
Wow. I mean, there's a lot to unpack even in that because, when would your dad have been a CEO? 60s, early 70s, around then?
He became a CEO in the early 70s.
Right. And I just had this conversation with a friend of mine who on a show we do out of Dubai, and we were talking about the early 70s and even right up until the end of the 80s was the birth of the Gordon Gekko mentality in business,
Mm-hmm.
which is greed is good.
Exactly.
Ayn Rand is the goddess of capitalism, and it's all pretty narcissistic and ruthless. And your dad was leading in the way that you and I would um, encourage leaders to do today. And leaders today will say to us, I don't know if I can do that. It's too difficult because I'm a CEO. I have to answer to the board, and the board want to deal with the bottom line. And I'm trying to be this humanistic, vulnerable, people-driven leader, service-driven leader. That's an interesting position that your dad was able to do that. Was he a CEO of 3 people, or was he a CEO of a bigger company?
Of a bigger company, a company that was called Columbia Nitrogen, which was subsequently acquired by a Canadian company, Potash.
Yeah.
But with my father, it was amazing. So many employees would tell family members, myself included, we've never heard him raise his voice.
Wow.
And I was like, well, come to our house and you'll hear it then. But he was able to lead in a calm fashion and through his humanity, which I look back on it now and it is unusual. But I will tell you an interesting thing that when I was in college, I took a speech class and I asked my dad, what's a good topic to speak on? He said ethics, because, and this was in the early 90s, he said, we're going to, in business and in the corporate world, we're going to have a crisis of ethics. And he was completely on point.
And you asked him that when?
This was in the early 90s.
Wow. I mean, wow. Is your dad still alive?
No, he passed a number of years ago.
Wow. Because that guy was like, I want to go over and rub his crystal ball.
No, but
And I mean that in the cleanest possible way.
no, but
I mean,
but
he was quite prophetic in servant leadership before it was the thing. He was quite prophetic in realizing that the real challenge is going to be one around ethics and morals and how we do business in that way. That, I don't think people even considered that in the early 90s.
no, and one of the nicest things that people say about him is that he was a true gentleman. So I was raised believing that being a gentleman was a good thing. But even when I was in office, people would say, well, why do you not just, raise Cain with your elected counterparts and just go off on them? I said, look, my father taught me to behave, whether it's in political office or in my business, to behave professionally. And I'm not going to change my behavior just to suit what people think is the typical norm of a politician. I'm just not going to do that. And that, to me, once you sacrifice your character, you've lost.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's I believe that in many ways it's everybody's playing in the circus and they're trying to be the bigger star in the circus. And I do realize, because as you know, I coach and executively advise leaders, and they're often trying to compete in the circus. And I'm like, you got to build your own tent, mate. You got to build your own tent. And they go, well, how do I get the people out of the other tents? Because they will get sick of the circus, and they get sick of all of that, and they go, okay, where's the sanity? And if you can come at it from that, yeah, it's not quite as quick at grabbing the attention, but it's will keep people with you. Now, with your 9 years in as the mayor of Augusta, Georgia, which I think people need to understand the demographics of that. We can come to that in a minute. But with that, And with the work that you've done and the work that you do with not-for-profits and your consulting and all the rest of the things, from your point of view, because I'm always fascinated by this, what's one thing that most people, particularly leaders, don't know or don't understand about politics that you wish they did? If you could sort of say, hey, you really need to get this, what is it?
The sad part about it is that in politics, a lot of political leaders give in to the vocal minority because they think that that's prevailing public opinion. But
Right.
when I was in office, I would have my elected counterparts say, "My phone is blowing up on this issue," and I'm like, "Well, how many calls did you get?" "Well, 10." And I would say, "Well, we serve a city of 200,000 people, and you're going to let 10 angry people influence you into making a decision that's not in the majority's interest and not focused on the greater good, but it happens all the time."
Mm.
And to me, that's not leadership. They're allowing themselves to be bullied. And a lot of, if you have to use fear and intimidation to get your desired outcome, that's not leadership, that's bullying. But we see a lot of that in politics.
But that's very interesting, isn't it? Because the I have a piece that I did, and actually an article that I'm working on right now, and it's called "The Good Germans slash Americans,"
Hmm.
and in which I talk about, because my family on my mom's side, some of them died in the Holocaust,
Hmm.
right? So, and I talk about how many good Germans were in Germany during the rise of the nationalist politics, who were good Germans. They were
Hmm.
nice people who had families there, who built businesses, and they were not going to, I can't walk away from the business. Yeah, I think this thing will blow over, and they are quiet, right?
Hmm.
And as Martin Luther King said, and others have said before him, the evil rises when good people do nothing, and but at the same time, it's that old saying that the squeaky wheel gets the oil.
Hmm.
And so if your phone is, quote, blowing up with 10 people and you're too weak to take that, then you bend to the will of 10 versus 200,000, rather than having a town hall and actually asking people who are quiet to come, or finding some way to communicate.
Exactly. And I feel like you need to go where the people are. So I'll
Mm.
give you an example. While I was in office, I was invited to speak at an event called Theology on Tap, right? So it's a bunch of 20 and 30 something years old that get together to talk about theology,
Yep.
which probably killed my political career because I'm on video drinking wine with a bunch of 20 and 30 something year olds. But I think about that, if we want to build cities and communities to recruit and retain the best and the brightest, that generation needs to be made part of the conversation. But they're not going to. I sat through so many public meetings in 9 years in office that were like watching paint dry, and I wouldn't have been there unless I had to be.
Right.
So I believe you really, as leaders, we need to go where the people are and where they feel comfortable, as opposed to just looking online. I think Facebook is any social media platform can be used for great good or great evil.
Yes.
But there are political figures that in local governments that think that the nastiness on Facebook, on commenting on different articles or media posts, that's public opinion. But if you go, I made it a point I always went to the Y every morning. I'm like, you're sitting around in a steam room and with a bunch of guys everybody's on the same level. You're not
Mhm.
above anybody else. To be approachable, then you really can keep your finger on the pulse of public opinion as leaders. But all too often it is, as you say, the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. But that's not leading, and that's not sustainable.
But again, in the context of politics and even in the context of leadership, and we're certainly seeing this more and more in society, is You just talked about going to the Y and sitting in the steam room. We're not doing that. I mean, not, and I'm not talking about because of isolation due to COVID. I'm talking about in reality, most of us are living in a bubble. And,
Hmm.
and I did a video more than a year ago, almost 2 years ago, where I said the worst advice you ever got was surround yourself with like-minded people. That's terrible advice because that is what the social media algorithm has done to you. You need
Exactly.
to surround yourself with people who don't see you as that and who will tell you things that they wouldn't normally tell. So sitting in the steam room at the Y, you're not the mayor of Augusta, Georgia. You're this sweaty bloke with a towel wrapped around you, right? And you're no
Ex-
different than any other sweaty bloke with a towel wrapped around you.
Exactly. And it's interesting. So in Augusta, we had a reputation for racial politics
Mm-hmm.
and still do to a degree. But I would tell people that going to the Y every day, you see from age wise, wise, just everything. It's the biggest cross section of the community.
Yeah,
And nobody was fighting. And actually, if you didn't go for a week, people wondered where you were. But
it was
we
a
also
community.
host a festival here every year called Arts in the Heart of Augusta. It's a festival about arts, inclusion, and diversity, which brings together over 90,000 people in our urban core on a yearly basis. We've never had an incident. And I'm like, if a community can celebrate arts and culture and diversity in that big of a way, that's what Augusta looks like to me. But that's not the Augusta that people that are keeping themselves in silos are seeing, which is unfortunate because a lot of the people in silos are decision makers.
And that for me, that nails it because that's the fault line of leadership is is that as a leader you have power and you have influence, but if you're living in a bubble, who are you having power and influence over? Those in your bubble. And who are you pissing off? Everybody outside of your bubble. And you're not really leading, you're bending to the will of the bubble. And that's not your people. And that's why I love the title of your book. I stated earlier, the title of the book is Changemakers. And the reason I want to know the reason you believe, because I certainly do, that true leaders are change makers. Talk to us a little bit about that because it's quite contradictory what we just said. That a lot of these quote in air quotes leaders are in bubbles.
They are. And when I decided to run for mayor, I had gone through a program in 2004 called Leadership Georgia. It's the oldest statewide leadership program in the nation, but I'm extremely competitive. So I was tired of hearing people from around the state ask me, what's wrong with Augusta's politics? So my graduation weekend, we had our third current or former elected official go under indictment. And that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. So our former mayor, Bob Young, took a position as Southeast Regional Director for Housing and Urban Development. So I didn't know I was supposed to kiss a ring, but I knew that things had to be done differently and that we needed new leadership. And I felt like it was my Trojan horse theory that somebody's got to get on the inside of local government to really push big ideas and good ideas. So when I said I was going to run, you'll appreciate this story. And as I say, I'm very competitive. I was taken in a back room by a number of business leaders that I knew and know and respect. And I was told not to run, that I hadn't paid my dues. And
Yep.
I was told that I was 37 at the time, that African Americans wouldn't vote for me, older people wouldn't vote for me, and younger people wouldn't vote for me because young people don't vote. And I looked the guys in the face and I said, look, I've chaired boards of directors. I've run a nonprofit. I've run small businesses. I've had all the leadership experience that I need. So what's so different about being mayor? And they had actually told me that, I would be the best candidate. I said, if you were going to hire a mayor, who would you hire? But they still discouraged me. The word in the older sections of town was that I wouldn't get 6% of the vote. But in a situation like that, they were out of touch. I had been out
Yes.
at the grassroots level talking to people about how much they wanted to see change with our local government. But if I had been insular and thought, well, these guys are really, they know what they're talking about, I wouldn't have run. And here again, I think I did a pretty good job for 9 years, and people said it was a thankless job, but I still to this day have people weekly coming up to me and saying, thank you for the job that you did. But here again, as change making leaders, you've got to be willing to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, and I love that as a theme because it's what you said, right? Leadership insists on a constant rejection of the status quo, but even when let's take it out of leadership, as humans, we're always checking in with everybody else,
Hmm.
and you know, it's part of my philosophy is the world is not changed by those who conform. You can't conform and change things. And people say, well, you got to get on the inside. Yeah, that's great. But if you get on the inside and then you conform, you've not made any change. Right? So, you did that. You got on the inside, but then you said, but it's got to change. And people don't realize how important that is because, one of you and I had a conversation about this. So a lot of people think that the people who voted in 2016 for Donald Trump were racist and misogynists. And I pointed out to them, go check the numbers because you'll find that the largest portion, that swing difference that made a difference, were the same people who voted for Obama. So they can't be racist and vote for Obama and vote for Trump. It doesn't make sense. What they were, the commonality, I'm not saying it's the same in 2020, but I'm saying in 2016, the commonality was these are people who wanted something different than politics as usual. They voted for Obama because they believed that it would be, and they got a corporate Democrat, and it didn't change enough for them. So they went, let's pick somebody who's outside of politics because maybe we've got a better chance. Well, you got something different. It may not have been what you wanted. And now a lot of people are embarrassed, and this is part of the problem at an ego level. They're embarrassed that they voted for somebody or something that is different, but they voted against rather than for, or they voted against Hillary rather than for. And as a result, they've got different, but it might not have been the different they chose to because they're being passive about it. And what I love, and you're advocating in the book, and even in yourself, and you and I in our conversations, is the advocation of self-reflection, the advocation of let me look at me, not just the people around me, but at me, and how do I need to get better in order to make the change. Talk to us more about that, because I think that is often we spend so much time looking out at them. They're the freaking problem.
Yeah.
And we want to make changes of you. We got to fix Donald Trump. We got to fix the Democratic Party. We got to fix Nancy Pelosi. We got to fix Mitch McConnell. Yeah, well, let's just start with you.
Exactly. And you and I have had these conversations. I honestly believe that if change is really going to come in our nation and every other nation, it's got to start at the local level. And that's, to me, so when I ran for office, we were losing population and had a shrinking tax base.
Right.
And knowing that and having studied cities, what that leads to is not good. But I felt like if I know that and don't try to do anything about it, then I have culpability. And I had people say, why do you want to get involved in all that? And I said, because if nobody tries to change it, it's never going to change.
Mm-hmm.
But I think too, the status quo is easy to cling to. It's safe. It's like a safety blanket.
Yep.
But I agree with you completely that President Trump got elected the first time because he was not a politician, and people wanted, as you say, something different.
Yep.
Hopefully, and by doing politics completely differently here, I showed at the local level, people will go to an alternative if you'll provide one for them. And I've shared with people that people said, how did you connect with your citizenry? And I said, I was vulnerable. I
Yeah.
didn't say I had all the answers, and I didn't hold myself to be above anybody that I served. And if there's a key to that, it's humility as well. If you make a mistake, own up to it. But it seems, particularly in politics now, it's all blame the other guy. And we're never going to take ownership when we make a mistake. And everybody makes mistakes. I mean, we're all human, but it's that vulnerability that in my book, a friend of mine, conservative Republican, read it, and he said, it's not at all what I thought it was going to be, which I understand. Most people probably think a former politician is writing a book on politics, not on leadership.
Yeah.
But he said, really, what it is it's you getting up and walking around naked for 9 chapters.
Yes.
And I said that's true. But when I first met with Forbes told me, they said, look, you're going to have to target a demographic. And I thought, well, I didn't do that for 9 years in office. I left with a 72% approval rating. I'm a huge punk rock fan, and so I let my punk rock ethos stir me, but I'm like, I'm not going to do what they tell me to do. So in the middle of the writing process, my editor said, this is really going to appeal to a wide range of people. And I thought, well, that's kind of what I do. But after the book came out, I had a girl who's a friend of mine here. She's vice chair of the Democratic Party, African American. She came up to me and said, I loved your book. My 18-year-old daughter loved your book, and you need to run for office again. And I'd vote for you even if you ran as a Republican. Same week, a gentleman, older gentleman that we know here, who knows the president and it was a staunch supporter, came up to me and said, I just love your book, and just went off on it. And I thought, well, did I tell him that the African American female vice chair of the Democratic Party felt the same way? But that's here again. Leadership is not pandering to the extremes, and it's gonna people are gonna raise Cain with you because you're different. It's okay to be different. I mean, the status quo is what got us in this situation in the first place.
But it's interesting because I saw an interview with Matthew McConaughey recently, and you may have seen that because he's doing his whole book tour. And he talked about being an aggressive centralist, right?
Mhm.
And he said, it's pretty lonely in the middle of the road, but he talked about this in quite a radical way that I just loved. And it wasn't libertarian, it was centralist. It was
Mhm.
very different. And I found it very interesting because, you know, I got to ask you, first of all, who's your punk band?
Well, the Sex Pistols and then Nirvana.
Yeah, I love the Pistols. I saw the Pistols when they first came to Manchester.
Did
So
you
we're
really?
talking about the very, very early days under when Tony Wilson was running Factory Records and all those kinds of things. Because I actually got to meet Tony, and my mom worked for Tony, and so I grew up in the punk world. Even though I was not a big punk fan, I am a huge fan of the Pistols, and one of my all-time favorite songs is Sid Vicious's "My Way."
Oh man, that is a classic. And I will tell you, Dom. So you know, Nirvana would be more modern punk, but
Yeah,
I bet I can say that I'm the only mayor in America, current or future or past, that ever moshed at a Nirvana show.
really awesome,
I did indeed.
awesome.
I was
But
in the pit.
but that the reason I bring it up is because I mean I think about because I'm old enough that I remember punk. I remember punk being born through the Pistols, and it was not contrived. It was people think it was contrived. It wasn't contrived. It was
No.
reactionary. The Jam was a reaction to the Thatcher politics of the day, right? Uh,
Mhm.
uh, Still one of the greatest bands of all time. The influence of the Jam has been huge. And some of those guys were actually a little bit older for punks.
Mhm.
So you got you certainly had the Jam. The Pistols were young, but you had Jam. You had Stranglers, who were both older, yet they were in those worlds, and they were a reaction to a political situation of saying we don't want politics as usual. And I've said for years that I think that music is art is an incredibly, that's why you brought it up before, is an incredibly important part of bringing together diversity.
Absolutely. And a band I can't believe we failed to mention, uh, talk about being political, The Clash. You
Yeah,
know, and they did, music does change things, and it also brings people together. But I've thought about it at the Nirvana show. I'm sure there were different people with different ideologies. I'm sure
right.
every concert you go to, but that doesn't stop us from just coming to enjoy the music. And when you go see a concert, I don't know anybody that's really talking politics, but that's what I love is the subliminal message of being there and listening to the lyrics, and maybe it makes you think twice about something.
Well, I mean, one of the things I talked about, I did a document that I wrote around advisory boards and why advisory boards need diversity. But I said, but here's two areas that you've got to have: women on your diversity board, women, and here's why: women are mothers. They whisper into the ears of their children who will be tomorrow's leaders. That's number one. Number two, I said artists. And when I say artists, I'm not talking about painters, although those are artists, but musicians, comedians, art, actors, whatever it is, because artists will say the things that nobody else dares to say. They'll say it in the expression of their art. They will say it in their expression of their comedy. I think that some of it, Dave Chappelle is an incredibly powerful political force because of his comedy. When I look at the art of Salvador Dali and I look at the art of Picasso, I see the reactionary to what was going on. Same even with Van Gogh and the time that was going on. This understanding that art is the expression. Why? Because it says what others won't say, but it gives us a common ground that's not left or right. We might go to right or wrong. Oh, well, this isn't art because it like the eyeball is up here and down there, or this isn't music because they can't really play instruments very well and they're the Sex Pistols. Yeah, but it speaks to something that is unifying and at the same time neutral while being incredibly provocative. And that is like, if I could say what is a great leader, what I call a dragon leader, it is provocative, but from a place of central standing that I can include you. So as you said, when I went and saw David Bowie the first time on the Ziggy Stardust tour, so in the 70s, I saw Bowie 3 times live. I went with my mate. Now I should tell you that at that time I had Ziggy Stardust hair, so like my red background, spiky, long back, and I had makeup on, and I was dressed in sequins. I went with my best mate, who was a full-blown looking neo-Nazi skinhead, shaved head, bother boots, all the stuff. He wasn't a neo-Nazi, but that's what those were at that time. We both went to David Bowie. We both loved the concert. And when Bowie threw his shirt out into the audience and somebody grabbed it, my mate punched him in the head, nicked the shirt, and gave me a piece of it. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about even gay and straight or anything else. It was about finding that. So I love that you bring that forward as a, Georgia politician.
Well, and it's interesting to me though too, and we touched on Facebook earlier. People are being manipulated and they don't know it.
Yes.
And basically painting the other as bad or evil or dangerous is stereotyping. We're manipulated through stereotyping. But I'll give you a great example. So James Brown's from Augusta, Georgia, and James Brown and I got to be good friends my first year in office.
Really?
When I first met him, he told me that he knew my people and that I was so fresh and so now that Augusta would never hold me.
Mates,
but
I got to tell you, you're my new freaking hero.
this is a great story though. So
Woo! I feel good.
I was coming home from work one night and I'm talking to Mr. Brown and we're talking about music and politics and religion, all the things that polite Southerners shouldn't talk about, they say. But he said, "Man, Deke, you're just like a Kennedy. Black people love you." And I'm like, "Man, that is the coolest thing that anybody's ever said to me." But what a lot of people don't know is that James Brown was a conservative Republican who endorsed Richard Nixon in 1972. So I got to know Al Sharpton through Mr. Brown. So I had a radio show for a year on conservative talk radio, which was the furthest thing from conservative talk radio. It was doing exactly what we're doing now, having conversations with people from all walks of life. But so I had Al Sharpton on conservative talk radio. And he said on my show, and I had Deanna, Mr. Brown's daughter, who's a dear friend of mine. He said, "You know, I, Mr. Brown was a conservative Republican, and we never agreed politically." But he said, "Deanna, you know, if your daddy was here right now, he'd say, 'Rev, Deanna, y'all need to respect Mr. Trump.'" And I thought, that should go viral. But so many people, and I talk about Mr. Brown being a conservative Republican, people locally here in Augusta have read my book and said, "I never knew." So
Right.
they're making an assumption because he's African American and he's in the entertainment industry. Certainly he's a liberal Democrat, but he wasn't, you
No.
know?
Yeah, and again, this is I think part of the challenge with leadership is I've had to catch myself. I will be honest. I've caught myself going, I'm having this conversation with somebody who I have decided is on one side, and I'm having a conversation without actually discovering first what side they're really on. And and I might be putting my foot in my mouth because I've not bothered to actually find out, and I've gone, that's so contradictory to who I am because I believe in deeply. My number one commandment is curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Curiosity is my religion, if I may, and it's this. And then when I find myself disobeying my own religion and assuming because of something, and I'm usually wrong. And that's really important to be willing to do that. You've done amazing things in politics. You're out of politics right now. There's something I want to sort of bring up to you because you're talking about doing things at a local level, and I think that that's great. And I believe you were the force behind two uh, historically sort of blighted and actually African American neighborhoods. Was it called the Laney Walker and the Bethlehem development
Mm-hmm.
projects
Mm-hmm.
that many people said were sort of a model for the rest of the nation. Last year, I had someone on my show by the name of Brooks Rainwater. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's from the National League of Cities.
Mm-hmm.
And we asked, are we shaping our cities or are our cities shaping us? And particularly in the context of, where I talked about the demographic of Augusta, Georgia, and
Mm-hmm.
racism and all those things. And I'm still at that thing is, it's the epigenetics versus the genetics. Are we impacted by or are we impacting to?
Well, I think we're shaped by it, but I go back to change making leadership. You have to get outside of your comfort zone. So
Yeah.
those neighborhoods, Lady Walker and Bethlehem, when I was growing up, we were told, stay away from there, don't go there. But while I was in high school, I was working laying tile. And so the older tile mechanics who didn't have driver's licenses were predominantly African American and lived in that neighborhood. So I'd go down and pick them up. So I got to know the neighborhood. So I knew the needs of the neighborhood. So and I always looked at things from a business perspective, but initially we raised $38 million in bond funding to help redevelop the neighborhood by increasing our hotel motel room fee by $1. So the city had to go in and become the master developer and build a market because there was no market in the neighborhood.
Hmm.
But I had a group of bankers. So we did a flagship development there, and it turned out great. But the local bankers didn't want to get on board.
Mm.
So I, they approached me with some friends in the African American community and said, "What can you do about getting local bankers on board?" I said, "Well, let's go down to the model home and have them come down there for lunch." So it's called Heritage Pines. But these guys came on board immediately, but they were walking around the neighborhood, which is a neo-traditional neighborhood, great porches, pocket parks, and they were just awestruck. And I
Mm.
told my then assistant, I said, "I bet they thought they were going to come down here and be in fear for their lives." Well, that's not the case. But from a financial standpoint, people said, those houses will never sell. So I was speaking to a civic organization that I'm now a member of, my then assistant was, and she said, "Before you give your state of the city, just know that there are people in this organization saying, why are my taxpayer dollars going to build houses in the inner city?" And so I highlighted, I said, Laney Walker Bethlehem, at that point, Harvard Student Design magazine had come out and said it was a game changer in community revitalization.
Wow.
But I said it's being funded by a dollar increase on the hotel motel room fee. So it's not local money going into it, it's visitors' money. And at that point, it had added $4 million to the tax base that was not there to begin with. We
Wow.
were at that point, after we took the lead and became the master developer, we were at a 5-to-1 investment ratio, private to public. So basically saying, what do you not like about that? But typical politician, my taxpayer dollars.
Hmm.
And I've said I never spoke in sound bites or rhetoric, because sound bites and rhetoric don't teach anybody anything. But I was speaking to a city manager yesterday, as a matter of fact, and talking to him about that project and what can be done in other cities that's very similar. So it does. A lot of people were made to be afraid of those neighborhoods. One of my favorite things to do while I was in office was to ride in the Martin Luther King parade, which went right through these formerly blighted neighborhoods, and take another couple and their kids with us. And they were blown away. But it's interesting. And you talk about getting outside your comfort zone. There's so many people where I live that don't even realize we have a Martin Luther King Day parade here in Augusta, which is unfortunate, but it's because people sort of get on their beaten path. But it goes back to what you said, Doug. How are you going to grow if you only hang around people that look like you and think like you and act like you? You're not. You're going to stagnate.
Yeah. So I know you talked about your dad and how he was, but were you brought up in that? As a kid, were you brought up with that crossing racial lines, political lines? Were you brought up with that? Because a lot of these communities are quite insular. The white people hang around with the whiteys,
Hmm.
and the black people hang around with the black people. And, there's all these sort of very insular communities.
I really wasn't. My elementary school and high school it was a big mix, and I had friends from all walks of life. And it's funny, I love all music, but I loved funk music and everything. I When we elected our first black mayor back in the 80s, me and my friends thought that was the coolest thing of all time.
Right.
But that's we were sort of we weren't from the old guard, so there may have been some of that. It was not in my household, but I will tell you, growing up in the South, you heard racial epithets used
Yeah.
regularly.
Yeah.
But my aha moment, and I talk about this in the book, I was working for Nations Bank, what's now Bank of America, back during the mid 90s, early 90s. And my best friend at work was an African American gentleman named Mark Jones, a black gentleman, whatever, anybody prefers to be called. But I say he happened to be black, because
Yeah.
I couldn't see why anybody wouldn't want to hang out with this guy. He was just a great guy. but we were cramming to get our Series 7 license. So we took a cram course and just outside of Atlanta, and we shared a hotel room for a week. And one night after dinner, he looked at me and he said, you know, if your skin was black, you'd be me. And if my skin was white, I'd be you. And at that moment, it just hit me that I'm like, anybody using racial epithets is talking about my friend Mark. And so it just, over time, it's almost like I didn't have to overtly call anybody else. Maybe it was my body language, but people stopped using racial epithets around me. And I think it really, sharing that story and that experience, I think it opens a lot of people's eyes. But if you don't have any friends from different walks of life, and it makes it personal when you do.
But that is a very important piece of psychology for all of the listeners and the viewers as we reveal this, which is nothing is real until it's real for you.
Hmm.
You know, I can remember, and I apologize because I can't remember it was, but there was a Republican senator um, probably 10 years ago who was talking, you know, he was fighting a bill of around same-sex marriage.
Hmm.
And he was, you know, hardcore conservative Christian. It's not right. I'm against it, blah, blah, blah. And then 2 years later, his son came out as gay and he said it evolved.
Yeah.
And you know, okay, I get that people evolve, but I had to laugh because I'm like, you didn't evolve, it became real.
Hmm.
It's a concept until it's real. And the analogy I used to give people all the time is, you know, it's a bit different now, but back in the day when we had TV with a cable and you flick through the channels, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, and every now and then you would arrive at poverty porn. If you don't know what poverty porn is, it's the kids in Africa with the swollen bellies and the flies on their face, and you'd stop on it for 2, 3, 4 seconds, and then you click off and you go to something else because you don't really want to watch that. And these were hour longs, and they were about raising money to help these kids in these horrible situations.
Hmm.
And it never crossed your mind again. If I said to you, did you see it? And you go, yeah. And I say, is it bad? You go, oh, it's terrible. And then you'd ignore it again. I said, but then if I just picked you up and put you in that village for 2 days with none of your comforts, but living with those people the way they live and around them, you'd fly back here and you would raise millions of dollars because
Exactly.
it's real for you now. That's the only difference. It's real. So till it gets real, it doesn't really matter. It's the circus. You're looking at it, but it's not really true for you. And so you go, oh, the left are a bunch of lunatics, or the right are a bunch of lunatics, but we're not really getting in there. And I think this is my opinion. I want to hear from you, Deke. I think that COVID has become this catalyst to the very worst of us and the very best of us. And I think that, you know, we're seeing that change in the demographics and the economics of city centers. We're
Hmm.
seeing it in political movements. I think it's making things real that were ignored, which is fueling a lot of extremism in politics, but it's also fueling a center that's still too quiet.
I agree, but I have hope for the future. I really do. And one of the things that I've been so encouraged by with my book is that it has been so embraced by the younger generation. And I think, particularly the Republican Party, I'm happily independent. But if you're not bringing in younger people into the party, or you sort of see the same thing in churches, that if you're not bringing in that young life flood, your time is limited, I would say. But that's, to me, I like to bust stereotypes, right? And it takes, I talk about in my book, it's to really lead in a change making role, you have to have a presence. I've shared with people that I was in Chicago doing a speaking engagement at the University of Chicago a number of years ago, and somebody asked me what I did, my driver, and I told him what I did. I was in office at that point. I said, "Well, how's your mayor doing?" Who was Rahm Emanuel at the time, and he said, "Well,
Yep.
he seems to be in the middle of everything." And I said, "Well, if the cameras are always around when he's in the middle of everything, then he's just got a really good press agent." But what I found in my time in office was 99% of what I did was not in front of the cameras. And if you're focused on redeveloping an inner city neighborhood, but you're just going there for photo ops, that's not going to build trust. And that's what we need to do, is build trust. But in politics, how do you trust somebody, particularly what we see, and is both parties are divided. Let's not just
Absolutely.
say that, but when people are constantly focused on stabbing you in the back rather than having your back,
Mhm.
that does not build trust. But leadership is about having people's backs. But I do want to go to being a myth buster. A great example happened to me this year. So on March 10th, I spoke at the University of Texas, El Paso. Their Student Engagement and Leadership Center had worked my book into, unbeknownst to me, they came across it themselves, into a Powerful Pages program. So I was able to go down there and speak. But I had never been to El Paso.
Mm.
So my views were skewed on, it's a border town. The Uber driver my wife and I got when we first got there, I said, "Well, how are things in El Paso?" "Oh, they're great. We love Juarez. We've got family over there and everything." So it wasn't like there was this army on the border waiting to invade us. And El Paso is the safest, at like for 5 years running, the safest city of 500,000 or over people in the nation. But I told him, I'm like, "I have learned about your city. I'm going to promote the hell out of El Paso, because I'm sure the impressions that people get in the media are not helping your tourism efforts or helping your economic development efforts." So our Uber driver on the way to the airport was like, "Please go out there and tell people about us." I said, I will, I will. But here again, my point of view was skewed because all I knew about El Paso was what I saw in the media.
Well, that's the problem, right? I mean, I think that, at using the example before is, you can look at someone like AOC, right? She's charismatic, she's attractive, she's highly intelligent, she's left of left, and she's very appealing to a lot of people. Green New Deal, etc. And at the same time, um, she doesn't understand the people of Appalachia, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
She just doesn't get them. At the same time, there are, you know, people who are on the other side who just don't get it. And so much of what we're fed tells us what a thing is. And you and I had a conversation about when I went and spoke in Iran, and it was one of my favorite gigs ever. And I came back and wrote an article about it because I wanted to bust the myths of Iran. Because when I asked people, tell me about Iran, just randomly, tell me anything you think you know. It's hot. Okay, what else do you know? Well, I think the people are mostly on camels, and and there's dunes and all that. Okay, what else do you know? Well, there's a repressive government there. They repress women, and they're radicals. And I'm like, okay, I got to write this article. So I wrote these 12 things, and one I said was, women per capita in Iran have more MBAs than any other place in the world, much more than America. Oh, they're not free? Okay. Women are repressed. Well, here's what you need to know. Most women, the favorite hair color, blonde. They dye their hair. That's not repressed. And they're not wearing, and if I know they have blonde hair, what do I know? They're not wearing hijabs. I can see their hair. They're wearing Western clothes and Western beauty. Are there, of course, people in full hijabs? Of course there are. Of course there are, but there are here too. So it's not true. By the way, When I went to my hotel, I didn't go on a camel. I went in a Mercedes. I stayed at the best hotel in Tehran. Yes. Where was it? It was at the top of the mountain, which is on a ski hill, and it was -4 degrees and snowing the day I arrived. How many more illusions do you want me to break? Because these are people that we other. And so we other places like El Paso, and we say, oh, it's a border town, and, they're dealing with, and we get imagery and we get things that we're sold. And so as a result, people say, I hate Trump, but has he had any good policies? The answer is yes, he's had some good policies. Do I like the person? No. Can I make the separation? Yes. And I think we've got to be bigger than shoving everything into a box and saying, oh, well, we should bomb Iran because they're making nuclear weapons, as opposed to these are people with children going to school. El Paso is the safest place in America. Pay attention. It's bigger than this micro information you're getting from some bullshit media source that's rigid.
No, and that's one thing I miss about during these times is I love to have conversations with your average man on the street from all walks of life. And that's where I come up with my bell curve theory. In 2016, I couldn't find anybody abroad or domestically that was excited about the presidential campaign on either side.
No.
And granted, I was not going to rallies for Trump or for Hillary.
No.
But most people are like, this is just ridiculous. I found the same thing this year, but obviously the bases were energized. But I had an Uber driver who was from Iran this last fall. And we had a 20-minute conversation. I said, what are things like in Iran? He said, our politics are awful. And I said, well, yeah, that kind of sounds familiar. But his wife was going to the dental school here in Augusta, and so that they had moved here. But after a 20-minute conversation, when he was dropping me off, I said, you know what it's nice to know is that a Muslim from Iran and a Christian from Augusta, Georgia could figure out we've got more in common than we have differences in a 20-minute Uber ride. So I talk in the book about you need to learn to listen without prejudice. If you're going to start any conversation on the defensive, you've lost the ability to make a connection there. But I give you a great example too. And this is what I realize. You talk about AOC not understanding Appalachia. I've got a good friend who is still a local commissioner. He's African-American. He grew up in an impoverished inner city neighborhood. I grew up at a country club, and we were both socialized in different ways.
Sure.
But that doesn't make, if I had grown up in his neighborhood, my worldview would be different.
Of course.
But just because we're socialized in different ways doesn't make you bad or wrong to have different views. And that's the problem with politics, is just the demonization. And it's on all sides. But how do you make progress if you can't seek common ground?
But that is your message throughout the book, is seeking this common ground. And, you even mentioned one of my favorite albums and you didn't even know it. And I love this album because it was out when I was going through a lot of change in my own life. It was after I had fallen and I was feeling like who I was not right anymore. And the album was called Listen Without Prejudice. And it was by George Michael, who had been Wham, and everybody's seen him as this sort of pop kid who was actually very deep and very philosophical, who had been hiding the fact that he was gay and had gone into a very dark depression and spent a long time there before writing this album called Listen Without Prejudice, which was, can you listen to this freaking album without shoving me into the Wham pop box of that I should be every girl's dream, and here's who I really am. Now, whether you like George Michael or not, that was a great, profound statement. I'm in a book called The Awesome Music Project, which is this beautiful coffee table book about music, science, and mental health. And it asked each of us who wrote it for the book to write about music and how it impacted us in times of struggle. And one of the albums I mentioned was Listen Without Prejudice, and the other one was the Joshua Tree, particularly the track which is I still haven't found what I'm looking for. And I
Mm-hmm.
find that people glam onto things because they actually haven't found what they're looking for. So when I see that polarized side, I'm always cautious because that to me is a statement. You've not found what you're looking for. How do I know? Because you're so hard in defending it. And that's again, we're back to the good Germans who
Yeah.
were, who, yeah, went along, but really were not really part of that at all. And they would have actually preferred to be decent human beings. And I think that middle ground of coming out and staying out is important. We're coming very close to the end of the show, but before we even get to those last two questions, I want to bring something forward that I know you are passionate about, and that is about young people coming into politics, but not as career politicians. Tell us what you mean by that and why that's important.
Well, to me, and here again, I get to the local level, but I was 37 years old when I ran and told that I wouldn't get 6% of the vote. But we had a group of 20 and 30 something year olds who brought so much energy and enthusiasm to the campaign. And I know this is going to shock people, but we actually had fun during a political campaign by reaching out to everybody and by trying to bring people together. So if it can be done here, it can be done other places, but you can't just tune it out. And I understand that politics, there's no authenticity to them, unfortunately. And this is a generation and the generations behind that really they're BS detectors. They've been marketed to their entire life. But I would just encourage that generation. Really, you're not just the leaders of tomorrow, you're the leaders of today. And
Mm.
leadership knows no age. So in Augusta, it's kind of um, patriarchal. So it's kind of, if you're under the age of 50, you should sit at the children's table. But really, the next generations are creative. They want to work together. They want to change the world, and part of the way that you're going to do that is through public service.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for that. Deke, I've really loved this conversation. I always love talking to you, mate. You're a good man. Um, a couple of last questions I want to ask you. Um, the One of the questions I want to ask you is this: what is something practical that our listeners, our viewers, can go away and do today? Because this is philosophical, and
Hmm.
we're encouraging people to think differently and to uh, to maybe shift their parameters of the rigidity and open up their bubbles, etc. But it's still philosophical.
Hmm.
What is the practicality? What is the one thing that you would say to them? Go do this today, tomorrow. Don't wait 2 days.
Volunteer. You can go volunteer at a soup kitchen. We have neighborhood cleanups here locally where people go in lower income areas and pick up trash. All of those things, that's leadership. And I
Mm.
would share with kids, if you see trash in your neighborhood, get a group of friends and you guys go pick it up. That's leadership, and you can do it and you be 6 years old, but just volunteer. That I'm sure in every city, in every community that your listeners live in, there are plenty of volunteer activities. I know COVID has made things a little different, but just look for opportunities to volunteer your time, your talent, and your treasure.
I love that. So I'm going to push back a little bit because you saying volunteer is like watching that poverty porn. Oh yeah,
Hmm.
he's right. We should do that.
Yep, you're
Squirrel,
exactly right.
right? They got distracted. How do we get them to do it? How do we actually get them to take that action? How do we get them to be uh, emotionally invested enough to take that action?
I'm going to touch on something it's like volunteering, but it goes to the common denominator. Everybody's being impacted by COVID, and I would say if you know somebody who lives alone, check on them. We had a good friend who lived alone. He had issues with alcohol. He lost his job and he died.
Mm-hmm.
So my wife and I try to make it a point to, particularly older friends who live alone, check in on them periodically. That's something, and we're all impacted by this. Your listeners, somebody lives alone. I'll guarantee you that. Somebody where you live. So just show compassion for people in your own communities. And that's something that you can do. But that really helps in a situation. It makes you feel better yourself. It's something that you can do to deal with COVID.
I think that's really good because I think we've got to make things real for us. And by the way, I would even go a step further to you as you listen to this. This year, 2020, I lost 3 people, all under the age of 40. Not one of them directly through COVID. One of them was indirectly through COVID. And what I mean by that is this was somebody with mental health issues who was one of my very good friends. It was his son who had massive mental health issues, who was doing very well. He was clean. He hadn't been on drugs in 7 years. He had a routine. And under COVID, he was isolated. And guess what? He overdosed.
Yeah.
And he died, 32 years old. That is incredibly, incredibly sad and preventable, because the number one thing we all have to remember, and I know it's really at the heart of what you talk about in the book, at the basic level, we are tribal. What does that mean? It means we are community. And if we don't remember that we are community, we're dead in the water. So, how are you being part of a community, even in COVID, even in isolation? Who are you reaching out to? Who do you have those conversations with? How are you checking in on the people in any way, shape, or form? Because that matters. It matters at a level of oxytocin in the brain. It matters at the level of immunity in the human being. Your immunity is lowered by lack of connection with other people. And by that, don't have to be in the same room, but connection, having a heartfelt, and you talk about it a lot in the book, and I talk about it in my book, vulnerability is what that takes. Show up. Let people see you. They don't need all the gory details, but they do need to know that you're real and that you're struggling and that you can relate to that. I want to thank you so much, Deke. You've been a tremendous guest, and you're a tremendous human being doing important work, and I really thank you for that. Please tell our audience where they can find out more about you and all the amazing things you do and all the resources that you have.
You can go to my website, deke-copenhaver.com. You can find out about my services. Also, Amazon has my book. You can buy my book on Amazon. And I just would encourage people. I think it's not a self-help book, because I'm a work in progress, as we all are, but it's just using real world leadership experiences from 9 years in office and in what I do now, just to help people. And that's at the core of what I do, whether it's my business, whether it's the book, whether it was 9 years in public service. I just really want to help people.
Thank you so much for that, Deke. And again, you can find out more about Deke at DEKECOPENHAVER.com. Of course, we'll post that on the show notes, including a link to the book, all kinds of those things. We're really grateful to Deke. Thank you so much for being with us. And for you, dear listener, remember that you can hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode or any past episodes by going into either our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. The truth is, it doesn't matter how successful you are. If your people, your employees, your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're only working at a fraction of your capability. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker, leadership strategist, or executive advisor for yourself or your organization, go to dovbaron.com. Because unified meaning, or as we call it, finding a dragonfire, is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about the difference you can make at a local level, not on either side, but maybe by finding the common ground in the middle, and how we're all a lot more alike than we are different. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your dragonfire to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.